My name is Brian T. Jackett, member of the Microsoft Graph team. With us, we also have Jason Johnston. Jason, if you want to say hello as well.
Hello, everyone. Jason Johnston with the Microsoft Graph Developer Experience team.
So as a little bit of a kind of caveat for this, this is basically a hackathon project that Jason and I worked on with the .NET Interactive team a couple months ago. And what we've done, we'll show you a little bit about what we've built. What we're really looking for is your feedback. Are there areas that you would see some use cases for this? Are there some gaps? We'll talk about kind of the whole, arching of what's available today, what kind of things we're working on, and some of the kind of future things that we'd like to look into. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of Microsoft Graph Extension for Polyglot notebooks. If you saw in the news about maybe 10, 12 days ago or so, .NET Interactive essentially renamed one of their extensions to Polyglot notebooks. The idea being that you can actually be able to put multiple languages into a notebook and be able to actually run code directly inside of there. So let's jump into things on here. So the first things I'd like you to do is actually just take a kind of close your eyes for a minute and dream really, really big for a second. And the idea here is that today we've got a lot of different things that we can do in terms of Graph Explorer, being able to actually see documentation, see sample requests. But when it comes to what's available in there, unfortunately, there's not really a way to do runnable code. We do provide a number of things for code snippets in a lot of different languages, would be either in C#, in PowerShell, in Java, JavaScript, Go, and more. But there's no real way to actually run those code snippets directly inside of the browser. So this is actually something that Jason and I kind of tackled as a way to be able to explore this. But when we look at kind of the current landscape out there, it's great that we have these SDKs that are available. But for folks who are developers, who are architects, who are testers, or any other kind of scenario, there's not really an easy way to actually run those code snippets out there. If I want to explore the API surface, what options are available to me? Or if I'm a new developer, maybe I'm a student, maybe I'm participating in a workshop or something else, how can I actually go and learn how I can query against Microsoft Graph? Again, we can use Graph Explorer for seeing things like the HTTP URLs out there, but there's really nothing in terms of the actual SDKs themselves. So when we look at the current landscape, there's a couple different options that might be available for learning different things. You got things like, again, Graph Explorer, we've got Postman, third-party utility, we've got Microsoft Graph PowerShell, as well as if you just do a simple kind of file new project inside of VS Code, Visual Studio, or your editor of choice. But with each of these different options, there's going to be a couple of limitations. You'll see for things like Graph Explorer, again, great. I can actually be able to run a query either against the sandbox tenant or against logging in on your own. I can really quickly and easily be able to run those commands. But it's only going to be for HTTP REST endpoints. There is no real SDK runnable code inside of there. And again, those snippets that we provide, those are really just kind of samples. You can't actually go and click and run on those kind of things. Next, if you take a look at something like Postman, this is highly customizable. I can be able to put in my own authentication flow, I can put in my own client ID and secret or certificate authentication and so forth. But it is a third-party tool. And we do hear from some of our customers that, hey, it's a third-party tool. I'm actually not allowed to use that in my production environment. Or the fact that it is HTTP queries. So when I actually go and try to adapt that to my own code base, again, I have to kind of translate and figure out, well, here's the HTTP endpoint. What's the actual SDK command or the method or whatever else I need to call in to get that? Moving on, we can take a look at some things like Graph PowerShell. This can be a little bit easier in terms of being able to run different kind of things against, again, multiple national clouds. As you'll notice, Graph Explorer today is only available for the worldwide tenants. If you are working with any of the GCC or China or other types of clouds out there, we actually can't go against those with Graph Explorer. This is where something with PowerShell, we actually do support different environments that you can switch between. But again, when you look at those PowerShell commandlets, it's not really intuitive always to actually translate that into here's what the SDK code is in some of the other managed code languages or JavaScript or similar like that. Similarly, if you wanted to switch between the version 1 endpoint and for beta, that is going to be like kind of a manual toggle on there versus in Graph Explorer, you actually have a little drop down where you can do that kind of switch out there. So again, you get some kind of partial support, but it's not going to be 100% available in there. And then we also have things, again, like file new project. So if I wanted to say, hey, go and spin up a new project inside of VS Code or go to the Graph Docs, we have quick starts. You can literally download and launch code in a very kind of quick fashion. With this, really, you can use any SDK that you want. You can use any authentication mechanism that you want. But you do have to go through all those kind of steps in terms of getting the code, finding the SDK that you want, and so forth. So it can be a little bit longer in terms of kind of the time to value to be able to run your first query out there. So let's pivot over to kind of what did Jason and I build. To give you a little bit of history on this, .NET Interactive, again, the extension for this has been renamed to Polyglot Notebooks, but the actual engine itself is still called .NET Interactive. This is really .NET support for Jupyter notebooks. The idea is that I can actually mix together code and text in the same type of file. So if you're writing something like a tutorial, if you're doing some type of kind of workshop, or if you're doing some kind of sample that you want to be able to, again, put that text for, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and then literally show the code that you have on there, you can actually run that code and see the output of it. And for .NET Interactive, we actually have multiple languages that are supported for this, things like C#, JavaScript, PowerShell, HTML, and more. One of the cool things, though, is that they have this extensibility model using things called magic commands. You can also implement what they call subkernels and a couple of other different things. But the idea is that if you want to be able to have your own command in there that does your own type of logic, your own type of authentication, or whatever else, you are completely free to actually go and do that. So if you want to get started, you can actually go take a look at the VS Code extension for this. You'll see it listed as either .NET Interactive Notebooks or, again, Polyglot Notebooks is the new name for this. Now, one of the cool things that we're looking at as kind of a future prospect, again, nothing committed for this. We've got things working locally, which is what we're going to demo for you today. It would be really cool, though, in the future, what if we could actually take that, runnable code snippets and whatnot, and actually put it into the browser? So again, nothing that we have available today, but things we kind of are looking at as a future state for this. Now, what does it actually look like in your own kind of local environment? So as a very first kind of starting point, you can see on here, I've got a new magic command. This is that hash symbol, the exclamation point or bang, and then Microsoft Graph. And with this, it's basically a command line interface. So I can be able to run commands, but I can also put code into there. So in the example here, you're seeing kind of the help information coming out of this magic command. Well, with this, one of the first things that we wanted to prototype was, well, how can I actually do different types of authentication against Microsoft Graph? As you may be aware, we're using things like Azure Active Directory with the OAuth consent and similar things for actually authenticating against Graph. So with this, we prototyped a couple different things for client credentials, for device code, for interactive browser. So depending on which type of authentication flow you want to use, we can actually support multiple different flavors of that. So as an example, if I take a look at, let's say, like an interactive browser, like literally when I run the code, pop open a browser, have me authenticate, and then I'll be able to actually see some output coming out of this. Similarly, if I want to do something like, let's say, for device code where, hey, I don't have access to a screen, maybe I'm on a mobile device or I'm on some other type of scenario where I want to prompt the user with, here is your code that I want to authenticate with, punch that into your browser with the different device code login URLs, and then you can actually go and get the output from that. There's also a couple things that we're looking into as kind of experimental or preview types of support. And this is really where things kind of get beyond just the standard, hey, I want to talk to worldwide cloud or the V1 versions of Microsoft Graph. We're actually starting to build in things like national cloud support. So if you wanted to talk against the GCC or the US Gov or the DoD types of tenants, as long as you have an application in those areas and you can consent and authenticate against them, we actually are starting to get some kind of, I'll say, quote unquote, experimental support for this. Similarly, if you want to go against the beta version of Graph, also some things that we're starting to prototype with this, where you can say, hey, I want to be able to mix and match not only V1 endpoints, but also beta because I'm doing some development, or maybe there's some new things I'm testing out that are only in the beta version. So with all this said, let's actually jump over to a demo and we'll show you what things look like in this environment. So let's go ahead and pull up VS Code. Here we go. And I'll share out this screen. Excellent. So what I have here is a sample notebook that we're going to be using against Microsoft Graph and be able to actually show you what things work with this. Now, the idea here is that you can see I've got these little different kind of snippets. These are little code blocks that are available to me. They're actually in multiple different things. If you see, I can go and edit this very first one. This is just a markdown block. So if I want to be able to put in my own text for markdown, I can literally put this into here, use the same styling for this. It's literally just text that I want to display onto the screen. Next, as we move down, you can see I've got different little snippets of code that are going to be in multiple different types of languages. Here you can see I've got PowerShell, I've got C#, and so forth. And as you go down, you can see I've got more things as actual output coming from these. So the first thing that we did was we actually built together a NuGet package. Again, this is something you can build locally. So if I actually go and run this little snippet, this is literally doing a .NET build on the project out there. And what we're going to get as output from this is going to be a NuGet package. And with this, we're actually then going to load this into our current context. Again, this is kind of a local build today. In the future, we'd love to have this as something where you literally go and pull this from the NuGet repository. But now, once this is actually available inside of your environment, you can see that I've loaded that package. Great. Now we actually do some things like, let's actually see what the help information is for this. Again, as you see on here, I've got all the different kind of parameters that I can pass into this to be able to see what's available for this. Well, I can use my tenant ID, my client secret. We've even got, as of last night, support for doing things like a config file, where I can actually pass those types of things in without having to do it on the command line. Also, other areas for like authentication. Again, do I want client credential, device code, interactive browser, and so forth? And then we'll talk a little bit more about the device code, or sorry, the national cloud and API versions a little bit later on. But for now, let's actually go and spin up 3 new graph service clients. And for each of these, we're going to be using different types of authentication mechanisms. So for the first one, I've got client credentials, I've got device code, and interactive browser. And you'll note that I'm actually giving these things names. So I can now be able to actually mix and match those different types of auth flows directly in the same notebook. If I wanted one thing to do during a certain area and one during a different, I can actually mix and match those things out there. So we're going to go ahead and actually test this first one with the Graph Interactive Browser. I'm going to pull up my other screen on here. This way you can actually see things happening in real time as they're going back and forth. So I'm going to run my first one in here, test interactive browser requests. You'll note that we pop over to our browser. I'm already logged in because I've got this as my browser profile, but I'll go ahead and say, yes, I want to log in as this user. Great. Now this code actually executed. And as you can see, we're literally pulling in that SDK code. This is what's actually going to be output directly into the screen on here. If I go down a little bit further, we can actually test out things like the device code as well. Let's go ahead and run this. You'll note that we get prompted for the go to this URL, and then here is my code that I want to authenticate against. So I'll go ahead and launch the device code website. Here you go. Again, we're going to be logging in as our user. Great, and it's going to say, yes, do you want to continue with this sample app that you have out there? Now this is actually running 2 different things in here. So the first piece is I'm going to do that same type of get me and get my display name in user principal. That's this first section on here. But I'm also outputting things like, hey, go and get the users of the tenant. And now we're using that fluent syntax that we have inside of the .NET SDK. And I can do things like select specific properties. So here I'm doing just display name and user principal name. I also want only the top 5 items that are available in there. And now when I output this down here, you'll actually see this displayed as this table down here. So now I've got multiple different users that are being pulled back from the SDK directly through this. So very quick and easy ways that I can take things that may have appeared directly inside of Graph Explorer, pop them into here in my notebook, and in a way you can run with those things. Lastly, we'll show you one more thing on here for client credential requests. If I go and hit run on this, there is going to be no auth prompts because I'm basically baking in my different client ID and secret into this. And here you can see I'm actually pulling back apps that are coming from inside of my tenant. So GC client credential applications. Again, I can do things to actually pull back just the app ID and the display name for this. And these are what I actually pull out down into here into my output. Now, let's actually kick this into one more level of what's available with this. So the next part is actually, what if I want to test against national clouds? Now, I'm actually going to flip over to my other browser window so you can see where this is at. Go ahead and prep this. Now, I happen to have already a tenant available for this for being able to do things against GCC. So now I've got a separate client for GC device code GCC, and I can just do the simple me against this to get just literally me as the user logged in for this. When I run this, now it's already authenticated in the browser over here. So what you're seeing is this is actually me, the user, but notice the URL that we're coming against. When I look at the SDK and look at the request adapter.base URL, you'll note that this is graph.microsoft.us for v1. So instead of being against graph.microsoft.com, literally going against the .us version of this, that's going to be, again, that GCC version of our national clouds. So really cool that we can actually switch on kind of the fly between different national clouds that you actually want to authenticate against. And then one more step out here is, well, what if I want to actually build into this beta support? So again, today with Graph Explorer, we can do that little toggle thing on there. Can we do the same thing here inside of the Polyglot notebooks? And quick little hint, yes, we can. So we'll see over here that we're going to do this Microsoft Graph command. Still going to go against the global national cloud, but this time we're actually going to go against beta. So all the same things that we did previously, can do client credential, device code, interactive browser, but now we're doing a separate client that's only going to be for the beta endpoints. So when I come down here, again, do same kind of thing for interactive browser.me.async, get async. When I run this, here is my browser. Again, we're going to authenticate. And the one difference you'll see is that when I output the values, yes, those are all still the things for the user, but Now, again, we're going back to the graph.microsoft.com, but this time going against /beta. So kind of recapping on things on here, we're able to do a lot of different ways to actually authenticate against different tenants. Again, it could be for your national clouds, could be on the different versions that are available, but also we're looking at other ways we can be able to mix this a little bit later on. All the samples you saw today, this is literally just for the .NET SDK. We are looking at abilities to be able to do this for other things. As you'll notice from the little code snippets block on here, we can also support things like JavaScript or also with PowerShell. We have not prototyped this yet today. This is an area that we're looking at as kind of future expansion. But the idea is, how can I make it super, super easy to be able to run Graph SDK code against multiple SDKs, against multiple national clouds, against multiple versions, kind of you name it. There's a lot of options that we see available for this. This is kind of early days for this, but we wanted to show this to you as a kind of a peek behind the curtain on what things we're prototyping with this. With that, I'm going to flip back over to the slides really quick. And let's jump to, here we go. So quick little demo to kind of show you what's available with this today. What do we need from you folks? We would love to hear your feedback on this. Is this something that you would actually use, or something that you have a use case that this might actually go and solve out there? Do you have different features that, hey, this would be great if you could prioritize supporting, X, Y, and Z? Or is it, hey, I tried it out, but I've got some issues with this. Like I ran into a bug or something didn't work properly. We really would love your feedback on this. We've shown this to some folks internally, but we don't actually yet have a proper PM or an engineering manager to kind of carry this forward. This is really kind of that, same hackathon project that we're trying to carry forward. Love to have your community support on this kind of things. So how can you get involved? We've got the URL here for the GitHub repo where we're actually hosting things today. We've got an active set of kind of issues and other pull requests that are going on kind of behind the scenes. Or if you'd like to even take a look at .NET Interactive itself, you can actually see the repo for this as well. Kind of see how do they build things, what kind of things are also available inside of this. So if you'd love to get involved, please, this could be as simple as putting together some docs for this, maybe some samples. Maybe you've got some other ideas for how to kind of solve some of the areas that we're looking into. Would love to have your community support on this. So follow, fork, that repo out there. Please do get involved and share with us, your feedback, your questions, other things like that. So with that, I will turn things back over to Vesa. And if there's any questions, Jason and I can be available in the chat to help answer things. But otherwise, please do subscribe, follow everything with that repo, and we'd love to see your contributions.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. Really cool way of having interactive documentation and samples directly within Visual Studio Code. So that's really awesome. Awesome direction for sure. So good stuff.